2021, I think the most impactful stories I did in 2021, the Cornflakes for Jihad, the Boko Haram origin story.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about it, because that was the story that brought me to you.
Right.
I remember reading that story about Boko Haram, and I was. It's funny how it all came about. Cornflakes, even the title of the write up as well. It's crazy how this organization that killed thousands of Nigerians, foreigners, I think at some point the American government had them as number one. Even ISIS was even number two. So Boko Haram we're talking about. And it's funny how we just came up from this kind of little thing that you talked about in your write-up. So if you don't mind, how did Boko Haram come about? Which is what you talked about in that write-up. What was the origin of Boko Haram?
So I'm just going to summarize the article really quickly. So it's important to understand, first of all, that even though that part of Nigeria, like northern Nigeria, northeastern, even some parts of northwestern Nigeria, has had issues with sort of violent Islamic expansionism for centuries, that particular expression of the problem is a fairly recent phenomenon. I've seen it argued in several places that, well, Boko Haram is just a logical result of things that came before it, like the Uthman Danfodio Jihad. To an extent, that's correct, but it's also important to add some nuance to it, which was what I tried to do in that story. That many of us, we have parents who grew up in the North, right? And they will always tell you that the North was a very peaceful place. Yeah, exactly. They felt at home there. True. I remember my dad, he used to tell me that he served in Sokoto State, and that at the time, the only reason he didn't stay in Sokoto State when his service year ended was that they wouldn't offer him, the government, because he wanted to be a civil servant, the government wouldn't offer him a permanent contract. That they just offered him a renewable contract. They didn't offer him a permanent employment contract. I didn't like that. That's the only reason he went back to Lagos, because there was a teacher in Sokoto and he was perfectly fine. Yeah. He had no problem. He was a Christian, he was a Jehovah's Witness, but he didn't have a problem. It was just that peaceful a place that even though they are all Muslims and he's a Christian, he didn't have a problem with him, he didn't have a problem with them. He wanted to stay there for the rest of his life. Right. So I think a lot of our parents have such experiences. Yeah. And then they will always say that something changed, and then they could never really pinpoint what it was or when. But somewhere between the 80s and the 90s, something shifted, and they don't really know what it was, and all of a sudden, the place just became what it is today. So what I tried to do in that story was to actually, for the first time, properly trace through that sequence of events, that this is what happened, this is who was responsible for it. So the key figures, not the people like Abubakar Shekau and Mohammed Yusuf.
He's dead now, leader of Boko Haram.
Yeah, those are the people. Those are the names we hear most often. That's the version of the story I used to hear. Between 2009 and 2015, 16 was Mohammed Yusuf basically led a band of extremists who were just basically politically expedient. They're politically useful to the Borno state government at the time. And then as soon as they were no longer politically useful, the Borno state government basically got rid of them. Yeah. Police did what they did. They shot the guy, they left his body on display, and then that radicalized his followers, and then it almost sounds like an unfortunate accident. Whereas that's actually not the case at all. Right? This was actually a very well planned, very well coordinated series of events that predated Mohammed Yusuf's rise to prominence. So the role that Saudi financing played, and the fact that this wasn't something that was unique to Nigeria, this was a thing back then that the Saudi state at the time, its method of building foreign influence was basically funding the expansion of Wahhabism across the world, right? And Nigeria was just one of those places. So the funding of the Muslim, I think, what was it called? The Muslim World League, which was basically a Wahhabi ambassadorial outpost. And the amount of money that was pumped into Nigeria from that thing, and the support it gave, doctrinal and political support that it provided to clerics that were embedded within the so-called Izala Society at the time. And the fact that even though the Izala Society officially is not Nigeria's umbrella Muslim body, but it became de facto Nigeria's most powerful Muslim body, and this was how it happened. This
Yeah.
was who funded it, and this was why. So that's how come in 1979, when the thing we now know as the Izala movement or the Izala sect, when it's crystallized into that thing, when it was given that name by Sheikh Ismaila Idris, that is how come from 1979 things started changing. And because our parents would always say between the 80s and the 90s something changed. They don't know what and why. This is what and why. So it was in 1979 that something changed. Prior to all of this, Sheikh Abubakar Mahmoud Gumi met a version of Islam on the ground, which was fairly benign, right? The Sufi and the Qadiriya sects in northern Nigeria, they had their issues, but they were not really expansionists, right? They were not violent expansionists. They had found a way. I think this is a very crucial point. They had found a way to syncretize Islam with their local customs and traditions. According to sort of religious purists, syncretism is some sort of like it's blasphemy, it's wrong, you're not supposed to mix different religions. But the reality of, and I'm not saying this as an atheist, I'm saying this from the point of view of just a sociologist, a historian, is when religions, foreign religions, find ways to syncretize with local customs and traditions, that's when they are less likely to be violent and dangerous. So that's how come, for example, the type of Islam which is practiced in southwestern Nigeria is not expansionist, because it has a high level of syncretism with African traditional religions. So you have a phenomena like the Alpha, for example. That's not really an Islamic thing, but it is in southwestern Nigeria, right? Because the Alpha is basically a syncretism of Babalawo and an Islamic preacher, right? So that's how come it's not going to fight its neighbors, because it has become part of that local ecosystem. The same thing with Christianity in Nigeria. It has achieved syncretism. So the Aladura people, for example, that, they are very complex set of rituals and stuff. That is a syncretism of Ifa, African traditional religion, with Christianity. And that's why those guys are not violent expansionists. However, what Sheikh Abubakar Mahmoud Gumi imported from Saudi Arabia, and with active ongoing help from the Saudis at the time, was religious purism, religious extremism in a way, because it insisted that any form of Islam apart from this one wasn't valid, and that any form of Islam that incorporated any sort of customs or tradition or practices that wasn't expressly stated in the Quran or in the Hadith, is that those people are as good as unbelievers, basically. So once you start categorizing people as true Muslims and unbelievers, you are creating,
of course,
they are laying the groundwork for violence, which is exactly what started to happen eventually. So what that story set out to achieve, to inform the audience about, was that you always hear about how, there's people who fund Boko Haram. These people are not demons in the sky. These are real people that you may not have heard of, but they exist. These are their names. So you saw names like, so obviously you saw the Sheikh Mahmoud Gumi, Sheikh Ismaila Idris, Yahya Jingir. You also saw the names of the money launderers who were involved with these people. Some of these guys who got very angry that their names were mentioned. So, like, for example, Ahmed Idris Nasruddin, the founder of a NASCO group. The late founder.
Is it NASCO?
NASCO.
That's sorry, that's okay.
The late founder of NASCO group. The company and his family, got very angry about the fact that they were mentioned. But the thing is, this story is not just making an allegation, right? There are U.S. State Department documents backing this
evidence,
up, right? There's so much evidence that's simply, and again, the reason why I thought it was very important to do this story was, and I've said this in several places, at the time when these things were happening, there was no internet in Nigeria. It's for the same reason why somebody will get a conviction for heroin trafficking in 1992 in Chicago, and then will be able to run for elective office less than a decade later in Nigeria.
We'll come to that later.
Because there was no internet. So there was no way to share information instantly in real time. So there was this sort of asymmetry of information at the time. So the fact that the founder of NASCO Group was designated by the U.S. State Department as a terror funder. And then, the Treasury Department, not the State Department, and that they published a very sort of detailed breakdown of exactly how this person funded this terror group, the institutions through which he laundered this money, and the fact that NASCO itself, like the U.S. government itself, considered leaning on the Nigerian government to basically designate NASCO itself as a terror financing entity, and that the Nigerian government itself seized NASCO from this guy for a while, because the Nigerian government itself, according to its own documents, the Nigerian government itself designated this entire business entity as a funder of terrorists, right? And then a couple of years later, after he, there were some asset forfeitures and he struck some kind of deal, the State Department, to the obvious displeasure of even people like the former State Department staffer, Victor Comras, who later came out to the LA Times in an interview and said, I don't know why we let this guy go, because he worked on that case. Obviously, this guy struck a deal like all rich men do, and he was able to sort of get himself off the hook, right? Even though the people who were designated alongside him weren't able to get off the hook. And all of this information is sort of has been hiding in plain sight for years. It's been on, UN document repositories. It's been in public records, but people simply don't even know that this information exists, much less how to find it. So I think part of my job as a journalist in an environment like Nigeria, where there has been historically this asymmetry of information, people don't know what they don't know, is to not just bring out the information, but also show people where the source is.